You are listening to Nqaba Mabece on SAFM. The time is 21:07 and we move on from matters of human rights, and I suppose in context of this coming conversation it's an extension of human rights. My guest this evening is Mr. Justin Hutting, Senior Legal Advisor at Strata-g Labour Solutions, where we're talking about the national minimum wage. Now, legal practitioners are urging businesses to comply with the new national minimum wage that took effect from 1 March 2025. The Department of Labour announced an updated national minimum wage at the start of February, implementing a 4.4% increase to 28 Rand 80 cents per hour. This adjustment applies to domestic workers and farm workers across the country. However, certain employees in the Extended Government Works Programme remain exempt, who remain earning a lower rate of 15 Rand 83 cents per hour. Now, of course, a national minimum wage is nothing else but that. It doesn't mean you cannot pay more. Experts also caution that employers cannot make unilateral changes to work hours or employee benefits to circumvent the new minimum wage requirements. Businesses are advised to ensure compliance to avoid legal consequences. In the next 15 or so minutes, let's have a conversation now with Mr. Justin Hutting to help us understand exactly what this means, when it's going to take effect, how it's to be regulated, and any conversations and questions that typically people might have at home, particularly because we are dealing with workers, let's be fair, might not be in a strong position to advocate or to try and enforce their own rights because of the challenges associated with information asymmetry, lack of skill, lack of access to the relevant information. That's why a conversation like this is important. Justin, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Welcome.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Okay, so this is good news. Obviously, it's an increase, and of course, an increase doesn't mean you cannot pay more, so people are always encouraged to pay more where they can. But in essence, the protection of vulnerable workers, especially domestic workers and farm workers in this country, cannot be understated.
100%, absolutely. And ultimately, the reason why we have the national minimum wage and also the various sectoral determinations is because of that lack of bargaining power in the historically lower paying sectors like farm work and domestic workers. Also, the casual nature of that work, means a lot of the times employers used to fly under the radar and would think that they wouldn't be, found out. And that's why they took advantage of the casual nature and that lack of bargaining power.
So let's talk about this bargaining power thing. It's not necessarily just true for domestic workers and farm workers, but I think in an employer-employee relationship, bargaining power is always going to be, if there is a tilt to favor, if you will, that of the employer. How especially vulnerable employees of the kinds domestic workers and farm workers are, can they be empowered, or how should they engage or navigate a conversation of ensuring there is compliance on the part of their employers, this national minimum wage?
Yes, ultimately what it comes down to is obviously knowing what the law says, and then once you've empowered yourself with that knowledge, you would then be able to approach your employer and be able to then negotiate with them on that basis. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what needs to happen is there must be compliance with the National Minimum Wage Act or even the sectoral determinations. It's the law. We can't get away from it. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, employers need to comply with what the National Minimum Wage Act says or those sectoral determinations.
But we know that that doesn't happen because of that critical matter that you say people must know the law so that they are able to enforce their rights. Where do you think, from your perspective as one in the labor law environment in particular, is the state or its agencies failing to sufficiently empower people of updates of the kind the one we are talking about is, and generally putting people in a position to enforce their rights? I mean, we are talking about national minimum wage now, but it could easily be a conversation about making sure that your employer puts you on unemployment insurance funds. Domestic workers and farm workers, for the most part, wouldn't even know what that is. Employers, typically somebody like me and you and the listenership of SAFM, know exactly what that is because where they are employed, they know exactly that UIF is part of the employment regulations, but they don't do that where they employ typically. How do we change that culture from a compliance or lack of compliance rather?
Yeah, so I think ultimately what it comes down to is a capacity issue. So first of all, the government and the Department of Labor need to be able to, get everyone out there, inspect and ensure compliance. And then also, I think it's also a part of, sensitizing people to what is required in the law. And that could be anything from roadshows, I think, to even placing, just a little notice in media and just informing people, this is what you're entitled to and this is what your rights are. And if there isn't compliance, what you need to do is approach your Department of Labor, who will then investigate those issues of non-compliance. Alternatively, if you feel that your employer has not been complying with national minimum wage, then you also have recourse to then refer a dispute to the CCMA in terms of Section 73, whereby then you can claim back those underpayments. And employers also need to be informed what the consequences are of non-compliance.
Let's talk about, in the relation to this national minimum wage, going back to this conversation. Of course, it's a nuanced conversation because, for instance, somebody could be on a commission basis, and I think this is typical of the retail space. Somebody who's in retail who earns commission on what they sell, does this national minimum wage affect them in any way or not? Please take your time to respond to that and help us understand the differences, if there are any, in there.
Yes. So ultimately, commission earners cannot earn less than the national minimum wage. So I think what it comes down to is, there's obviously going to be the issue of your commission that you're entitled to on your sales that you've made. But ultimately, there should also be a basic, salary that is paid to that employee in the retail space to ensure compliance with the national minimum wage. As you said at the outset, we can't structure someone's terms and conditions in such a way that then we are trying to avoid what the law requires. So even if, this person is earning commission, they can't earn less than the national minimum wage. It is a legal requirement that they must be paid accordingly.
Talk about bargaining power. Let's talk about all of these things and let's put them together. How can these employees coordinate better? Typically, some of them are employed in many homes. For instance, if one is a domestic worker, one won't necessarily hold employment with one person, but they go and work once a week at a particular home. That obviously creates the kinds of vulnerabilities that the national minimum wage, among other instruments of the state, try and circumvent. How can that person, together with other persons in a similar position, coordinate so that they can enforce, that they can increase their bargaining? Perhaps, I don't know if there's even a union that is available to represent their sort of interest. Of course, farm workers are just as vulnerable because they are oftentimes, if not exclusively, isolated from mainstream everything, and they're living on the land of the farm owner, so there are those inherent factors that skew even more the bargaining power position. What is it that can be said for these extremely vulnerable communities to be in a better position through empowerment, through bargaining of the kind that is necessary then to know their rights before they can enforce them?
So what's happened now is I've seen that a lot of unions have changed their constitutions, which then allows them to recruit outside of specific sectors. So going forward, I think a lot of farm workers, domestic workers would have access to that union representation, number one. But number two, what they can also do is they can, as you said, come together, coordinate with each other, and then form a bargaining unit and then be able to then just, enforce those rights. Same with the farm workers. There are agricultural unions out there, and there are unions now that have specifically catered for domestic workers. So I think it is changing. I think there is definitely an ability now to bargain with employers on an equal footing and then, not be taken advantage of and then having to accept less than what is required.
Final question to you. Let's talk about the enforcement mechanism thereof. If anybody has any issues in relation to the enforcement of this national minimum wage standard, where can they go and how typically can they go about lodging a dispute at that particular agency?
Yes. So ultimately what would happen is an employee can then lodge a complaint with the Department of Labor if they believe that their employer is not complying with the National Minimum Wage Act. And then once that complaint has been lodged with the Department of Labor, a labor inspector then will investigate the alleged non-compliance. And if it's found that there is non-compliance, what usually happens is an employer will be fined double the amount of the underpayment for first offenders for each employee concerned, and then triple for repeat offenders. In addition to that, what could happen is then they could also get a non-compliance order that is issued against the employer that's offending against the national minimum wage. That can then be treated as an arbitration award, and ultimately, steps can be taken to execute that award. Alternatively, as I said before, an employee is then also entitled to refer a dispute to the CCMA, where that dispute will be heard and a commissioner will make a decision and then ultimately say, listen, employer, this is the amount of money you owe your employee and you are ordered to pay it. And once again, if there's non-compliance with the arbitration award, it can be made an order of court, and it can also be executed in the same way as the compliance order from the Department of Labour. So there are different avenues that can be taken by employees to enforce compliance with the national minimum wage.
Let's leave it there. Thank you so much, Justin Hutting, Senior Legal Advisor at Strata-g Labour Consultants, for your time in explaining what is very important, and let's hope that all of those who should have heard this, to the extent necessary, will hear and, importantly, apply it. Thanks for your time.
Absolutely. Thanks very much.
Indeed. 21:18 is the time. Let's take a short ad break before we go on to have the interview that, unfortunately, we were not able to have last week. That's the interview with the